Greetings, it's David McNabb and the Creation Corner show, and I'm glad you tuned in today for another episode of our creation programming here on the Prescott E-News, and great to have you on board today. We want to bring some creation science knowledge to folks that are watching the show. Some people may not even know what creation science is. And that's the science that supports the biblical account of creation and the flood in the first 11 chapters of Genesis. So that's what it's all about. Started in 61, really, with a book by Henry Morris and John Whitcomb called The Genesis Flood. And since then, there's been a huge proliferation of books, DVDs, and organizations that present this information to people in churches, in schools, and conferences, in not public schools, unfortunately, the Christian schools, and the camps. And what do I have with me today as my guest is Mike Byrd. And he's local here to Prescott, lives in Prescott, and he's a realtor. And he's written this book here on creation science called Is Old Earth Creationism Biblical or Scientific by J. Mike Byrd. And you can find this on Amazon. And he's written 23 other books besides this one. But this is the one that I want to show you today because it is a creation science book. And so I'm going to turn you over to Mike, and he's going to give us some information about what's in his book and about the Big Bang Theory, which a lot of people have heard some about, but may not know the whole story with that, especially on the creation science view. All right, Mike, tell us about your book.
All right, well, I want to discuss, is Old Earth Creationism biblical or scientific, and does it undergird or undermine true Christian faith, which is the title of that book. Now, I'm a layman, not a scientist, but I do have a background in aeronautical engineering and a couple of master's degrees. And what I'm trying to do in the book is I make an attempt to bridge a gap between the sophisticated scientists and the average layperson. And I want to do that by addressing key issues in this creation evolution debate, hopefully in terms that average people can understand. The main point of the book is, as the title indicates, it's to take a critical look at the truth claims of the increasingly popular Old Earth creationism, and in particular progressive creationism, such as represented by Dr. Hugh Ross of Reasons to Believe. So I begin with addressing the claim that Old Earth creation theories, which are mostly evolution with a God factor interjected, is actually biblical. As do many others, I briefly expose the weaknesses of their arguments, especially their exegesis of key words such as the Hebrew word yom, which is translated day in Genesis, as well as some of the contradictions of their interpretation of that word, meaning long ages, how there are contradictions with many other passages of Scripture. And then I go into the science to address what I believe are key issues with respect to the unscientific nature of the whole theory of evolution. Now, my contention is that a person doesn't need to know everything about a theory or about science to be able to discern between what is reality-based and what is flawed and lacking in credibility. It's kind of like in courts of law where the truth with respect to the past is based on evidential testimony. And a verdict is reached based on certain key facts that are usually incontrovertible. They're probably seldom based on all the evidence agreeing to give an undisputed conclusion. So I think average people don't need to be scientists. And they don't need to know everything about the science of evolution versus creation. But they need to be able to make judgments about what is credible and what is not. And to do that, they do need to know certain facts about the biblical account and the science, at least in order to be able to rationally defend their position and to be able to pass it on within their sphere of influence, which may be their own children or their grandchildren. So in the book, I address the following key issues. First, this old earth versus young earth. Does it really even matter? I have Christian friends who have said, well, they don't care, they don't think it matters, as long as you believe in God.
I've heard that one too.
Yeah, so I go into that a little bit, and then I address, are the old earth theories even biblical, and are they scientific? And then under that heading of are they scientific, I go into the empirical versus formal science, which I believe there's a distinction between these two approaches. And I go into the Big Bang and Cosmological Principle, which I plan to talk about mostly today. I go into uniformitarianism and gradualism versus global catastrophism, which is mostly about Noah's flood. And I go into evolution's geologic column, dating and fossil record, and the dinosaurs. I call it Let the Dinosaurs Speak. I go into intelligent design versus natural selection, and the evidence from microbiology and DNA. And I go into some other invalid arguments, and finally the logical problems with progressive creationist views. Their dilemma, the dilemma for the old earth creationist. And I've done this all in less than 100 pages, which was my goal, to try to keep it simple for the layman.
That's pretty amazing, because that's a lot of important stuff that you covered right there in that book. And I have read the book, and I thought it was very well done, well organized, well presented.
Well, obviously, I'm not going into deep science of it or highly technical.
But there is a lot of science in it, though.
Yeah, I'm hitting on the real, what I call the zingers, and the ones that I think you can take away and maybe be able to pass on to somebody else without having to get deep into the science of it all. Right. So, okay, I believe the most important and the most powerful piece of empirical evidence that we have scientifically today is what I would call intraconvertible evidence that refutes evolution's deep time and the old earth theories and their geologic column and their dating techniques, is what I refer to in the book as Let the Dinosaurs Speak. Actually, this is the subject of another presentation, which you may have already seen, by a real scientist, Dr. Kevin Anderson, who has found soft biotissue and protein in a Triceratops horn. And that agrees with other scientists and what they have found, including the now famous evolutionist, Dr. Mary Schweitzer. And they describe this as collagen or fragments of blood vessels that they found in these dinosaur bones. Now, probably everyone, including scientists, know that such soft biomaterials cannot possibly survive even 1 million years in the best of conditions and scenarios, and yet here they are. So the old Earth evolution theories, they need these extinct dinosaurs to be at least like 68 million years old. And that's not exactly empirical science, is it? However, I want to leave that subject to Dr. Kevin Anderson, and I recommend his video and his book, Echoes of the Jurassic, which I think Kevin talked about in his session.
And that's also a DVD as well.
Yeah. So today I want to focus on what I guess is the starting point for this whole theory, upon which the rest of the theory rests, and that is the Big Bang Theory. Now, if you've lived on this planet very long and have any education at all, you know that everything began with a Big Bang, at least according to the so-called consensus of scientists. In fact, even such notable Christian creation evolutionists or progressive creationists as Hugh Ross apparently believe in this initial Big Bang event. So he agrees with the atheist evolutionist explanation as the universe having started with an infinitely or almost infinitely dense, tiny ball of matter in the universe. And that's because it's under the infinite or near infinite force of gravity, which suddenly began to expand very rapidly because of the very hot gases, hence the bang.
Boy, it sounds like there's a miracle involved with that kind of gravity, because it sure isn't present today.
Yeah, that's part of the problem is their explanation. They want to exclude the miracle part of it. So, we'll take a look at what some of their explanations are.
And they came up with a name for this little tiny dot called a singularity. They're so proud of that they have a name for it.
Yeah.
But just because you have a name for it, it doesn't mean it's true.
Well, we're going to talk a lot about that too, and how they do or don't define it. Mm-hmm. But the one thing they don't want to call it is an explosion. So the popular idea is, a popular version of it would be that there was an explosion, but they say, no, it's not an explosion, but it is rapid expansion.
Extremely rapid.
Yeah, so rapid that it sounds like an explosion.
Yeah, that's right.
With regard to the
Not a lot of difference.
how fast the expansion was. Yep. Okay. Now this popularized Big Bang theory is based on a couple of principles. First of all, there's Albert Einstein's general theory of relativity, which correctly describes the gravitational interaction of matter, at least as far as I know. But then they have the cosmological principle. Okay, this cosmological principle is defined as, and I'm going to quote from Webster's dictionary, a principle in astronomy, the distribution in the universe, the distribution of matter in the universe is homogeneous and isotropic, except for local irregularities. Now, there's a problem right there because according to sources like the Encyclopedia Britannica, this does imply, and again I'm quoting from them, this does imply that the Big Bang occurred not at a particular point in space, but rather throughout space at the same time. So you can see how this conflicts with at least the popularized view of what the Big Bang is, and starting with that tiny ball somewhere. Wasn't in space, but whatever was before space. Okay.
Well, it sure sounds like a miracle to me, Mike.
Yeah.
Almost nothing that's infinitely dense becomes everything. We don't know how that happened, of course. But it just happened. We just accept that on faith.
Yeah, definitely a matter of faith, though they say it's not. They say it's science. So now there is a difference here with the progressive creationist Dr. Ross's view, in that he credits God with having caused this initial event. So we'll give him credit for that. But it is a little inconsistent with his whole naturalist approach to the whole thing. However, as pointed out by Dr. Jonathan Sarfati in his book, Refuting Compromise, which I found to be a very valuable resource, and I also quote from him, he's saying that the popular view of the Big Bang, which Ross seems to foster, pictures the universe exploding from a central point in a universe bound by an edge. So, indeed, we have the rapid expansion, as they prefer to put it, which would otherwise be called an explosion, I think, given the temperatures and pressures and the rate of expansion and the time involved in their theoretical explanation. Furthermore, their hypothetical tiny ball would have to be a point in space or whatever they suppose existed before space. So this implies a definite time and point of origin. But herein lies a contradiction with their own interpretation of the cosmological principle that the Earth is not in a special place because the Big Bang occurred not at a particular point in space, but rather throughout space at the same time. I suspect that most people don't realize that that's part of the theory.
I don't know that that makes any sense at all.
Yeah,
it
that's
certainly sounds like a miracle to me.
sounds a little contradictory, but
They have miracles, but they don't have a miracle maker.
exactly.
That's the problem.
Well, there's another problem. This interpretation of this cosmological principle, it turns out, is strictly philosophical. It's not scientific, as in based on empirical scientific evidence. Some of you may be familiar with the name Hubble, and in Hubble's words, he says, and I quote, "Such a condition would simply imply that we occupy a unique position in the universe, but the unwelcome supposition of a favored location must be avoided at all costs. Is intolerable. Moreover, it represents a discrepancy with the theory because the theory represents homogeneity." And this is coming from The Observational Approach to Cosmology, which is Hubble's book. Well, this actually concurs with an admission from a recognized contemporary scientist. His name is George F.R. Ellis, and he co-authored a book with Stephen Hawking entitled The Large-Scale Structure of Space-Time. And I will quote from him. He says, "People need to be aware that there is a range of models that could explain the observations. I could construct you a spherically symmetrical universe with Earth at its center, and you cannot disprove it based on observations. You can only exclude it on philosophical grounds. So we are using philosophical criteria in choosing our models. A lot of cosmology tries to hide that." This was actually published in Scientific American, and it's an article entitled "Profile George F.R. Ellis, Thinking Globally, Acting Universally." Now, you mentioned singularity, which is what they're calling it now. And this current Big Bang theory is now referred to as a great singularity, which has been popularized by the most famous name in cosmology today, which most people probably recognize, the late Stephen Hawking. I'm going to give you some quotes from Stephen Hawking's more recent books, which I think tell us a lot about the current state of this supposedly well-established scientific theory. So, starting with quotes from his book, A Brief History of Time, he says, "I developed new mathematical techniques to remove this and other technical conditions from the theories that prove that singularities must occur. In the end, our work became generally accepted, and nowadays, nearly everyone assumes that the universe starts with a Big Bang singularity. It is perhaps ironic that having changed my mind, I am now trying to convince other physicists that there was in fact no singularity at the beginning of the universe. As we shall see later, it can disappear once quantum effects are taken into account."
So their story changes.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it actually changes all the time.
Well, what is evolving mostly is the theory of evolution.
Yes, their theory evolves, but it still is terribly inadequate.
Yeah. So, and that's necessary. They have to keep evolving and they have to keep moving because they got to be a moving target here. Another quote, "General relativity is only an incomplete theory. It cannot tell us how the universe started off because it predicts that all physical theories, including itself, break down at the beginning of the universe." So that's a rather revealing admission.
Yes.
But he goes on to say, "One has to use quantum theory of gravity to discuss the very early stages of the universe. As we shall see, it is possible in the quantum theory for the ordinary laws of science to hold everywhere, including at the beginning of time. It is not necessary to postulate new laws for singularities because there need not be any singularities in the quantum theory. So, what do you make from that?
I just don't think they know what they want to believe.
Yeah. Well, it gets worse. So, what has happened to the Great Singularity, which was supposed to be the Big Bang? Here he says there need not be any singularities in quantum theory, and he's saying that quantum theory is the answer here, although we don't know what those answers are yet. So after proving there was a big singularity in the 1970s, Hawking then tries to prove there wasn't one. So while still using the term Big Bang, he then later works, actually I should say in his later works, like in these later books, he proposes a no boundaries theory, meaning no beginning and no end in real time, which he calls no singularity. Now, the key word here, I guess, is this word real time. But he goes on to argue that imaginary time and imaginary numbers become more real than real time or real numbers. Again, quoting from his book, A Brief History of Time, this might suggest that the so-called imaginary time is really the real time, and that what we call the real time is just a figment of our imaginations, just an idea that we invent to help us describe what we think the universe is like. So for the purposes of the calculation, one must measure time using imaginary numbers rather than real ones. So from the perspective of looking for reality-based science or faith, what does this say?
At least they're admitting that it's imaginary.
Yeah.
You know, we're just making this stuff up, guys. So, but believe us because we're smart.
Yeah.
We're smarter than you. So therefore, you should believe us.
Yeah, especially if you believe in the Bible and God and creation and all that, then you have a blind faith.
Yes.
Well, I'm wondering who has the blind faith? Who is working in the realm of reality, and who's working in this imaginary realm, which is, of course, necessary for the whole theory. Well, then we also have the expert opinion of another noted astrophysicist, which seems to refute the claim that there is this consensus of all knowledgeable scientists on this subject. Ethan Siegel, who actually blogs on a site entitled Starts with a Bang, he posts an article on Forbes.com entitled, "There Was No Big Bang Singularity." Now, in that article, he makes the following declarations. He says, "But no matter how far back you go, you never achieve a singularity. Every time you see a diagram in an article or a story talking about the, quote, Big Bang singularity or any sort of Big Bang singularity existing before inflation, know that you're dealing with an outdated method of thinking. There may have been a singularity at the very beginning of space and time, with inflation rising after that, but there's no guarantee. In science, there are the things we can test, measure, predict, and confirm or refute, like an inflationary state giving rise to a hot Big Bang. Everything else is nothing more than speculation." So perhaps the underlying problem is this, that this singularity is largely undefined, except in rather vague terms. So a definition given in All About Science explains this as follows. And again, I quote, "According to the standard theory, our universe sprang into existence as singularity around 13.7 billion years ago. What is a singularity? And where does it come from? Well, to be honest, we don't know for sure. Singularities are zones which defy our current understanding of physics. They are thought to exist at the core of black holes. Black holes are areas of intense gravitational pressure. The pressure is thought to be so intense that finite matter is actually squished into infinite density, which is a mathematical concept which only boggles the mind. These zones of infinite density are called singularities. Our universe is thought to have begun as an infinitesimally small, infinitely hot, infinitely dense something, a singularity. Where did it come from? We don't know. Why did it appear? We don't know. So it seems to me, for anyone so cocksure, that the Big Bang singularity theory is established science. These admissions and qualifications from Hawking's books, The Illustrated Theory of Everything and A Brief History of Time, should be taken into consideration and critically evaluated. In the Illustrated Theory of Everything, he says, we don't yet have a complete consistent theory that combines quantum mechanics and gravity. And then in A Brief History of Time, he admits, any model that described the whole universe in detail would be much too complicated mathematically for us to be able to calculate exact predictions. Well, then there's also a qualifying statement by Marcelo Gleiser, a PhD, in his foreword to Hawking's book about the Illustrated Theory of Everything. And again, I quote, a proper scientific description of the Big Bang can only be obtained once we know how to combine quantum mechanics with Einstein's theory of gravity. Unfortunately, so far, we haven't been able to do this. So I think one might
What a surprise.
One might want to question whether this is what you would call reality-based science. It seems that Hawking himself admits that it is more imaginary than real, and perhaps not even based on known proven facts, but much more philosophy, speculative theories than empirical science. Acknowledging that all mathematical formulations, as per the theory of relativity, break down at the beginning, but then concluding that there really is no such beginning in real time, but counting on the hope that quantum physics will find a solution to this obvious dilemma. Is this science? I think honest scientists seem to be admitting that there are now more questions than concrete answers.
Mm-hmm. The honest ones. Only the honest ones, mind you.
Yeah, that's right. And so in order to make their Big Bang models work, all these scientists have to theorize that more than 90% of what the universe consists of is somewhat unknown element or elements, which they call dark matter and dark energy. Well, this term dark is used because it's never been observed. And it can't be observed or measured directly, but is only inferred from what is observed, such as relative motion of stars and galaxies and black holes, etc. And then processed using the models, which assume some theoretical version of the Big Bang. This is where the empirical science is replaced by formal science. No actual observation necessary. Seems to me that the amount of dark matter and energy is actually the amount of discrepancy between the mathematical calculations based on what actually can be observed and what their theory predicts should be observed. Now in engineering, and that's my background, this is what we call a fudge factor. But what do I know? Whether or not there actually is something which is being, which correlates to this, what is being called dark matter and energy, I think the critical thinker must recognize that this is more speculative theory than established fact, and not all scientists agree with the theory, but some have other explanations for the observed phenomenon.
You know, I know you've got more to talk about here, and it's very interesting, but we need to wrap it up, and I want to recommend this book to everyone that is watching. From J. Mike Byrd, you can get it on Amazon, is Old Earth Creationism Biblical or Scientific. And you'll get a lot out of this book. I did. when I read it. It covers all the basic stuff on creation science that you need to know. And Mike, you know what strikes me about what you were saying is that these guys really have little or nothing actual evidence, scientific evidence to go on.
Yeah.
It's all well, we think this, but and I think this is really how it happened, but they present it like it's some kind of scientific reality,
Exactly.
some fact that you've got to believe because hey, I know what I'm talking about. I got a PhD in this, and I'm smart, and you're not. So listen to me. Now, here's the other thing that strikes me: these guys will not debate creation scientists. They won't do it.
Yeah.
If they're so smart and they have all the answers, why won't they debate?
Like Kevin said, you welcome debates, but
They won't do it.
there's no scientists that are willing to.
No, they're not. And
Danny Faulkner, the same thing, and others.
absolutely. And if you're a scientist watching today that does not believe in creation science, so you're an evolutionist, and you're willing to debate, contact me. I would love to set you up with a debate with Dr. Kevin Anderson, who has a PhD in microbiology, and we'll see how it goes. We'll see if you can handle it in a debate.
And I think it's important to recognize the distinction between empirical science, like Isaac Newton and all those others we're using, and what now is formal science, which is mostly about computer modeling based on theories.
Yes.
So it's highly theoretical.
Yes.
And not much factual, empirical.
And with your engineering background, you are all about finding solutions for problems and using real evidence, real science, and none of this theory applies.
Yeah. Yeah, and there are some good other theories that I think are superior to the Big Bang. One of them is Danny Faulkner's, which is in his book, Astronomy.
Right.
And this is kind of written so that I think most people can understand it pretty well without being scientists. And there's another one that I thought was really good from an unknown scientist, and it's called The 4 Days. Let's see, I have it in here. The First 4 Days. It's Delmar Dauberpool. And to me, this explanation, it's more technical, but it's more consistent with what I understand of quantum field theory, which I believe is the emerging science physics that has the most answers to things.
Yes.
So, I recommend Dr. Dauberpool's The First 4 Days.
Yeah, I have that book, and he's local as well.
He is, I actually got it from him. But, so there's other models. There's several others that creationists have come up with that.
And yes, and Danny Faulkner is a great astronomer. He has a PhD in astronomy. He works with AIG, Answers in Genesis.
Oh, okay.
And he does a great work. He speaks quite a bit too, and he's willing to debate. If you're an astronomer and you're ready to debate, let me know. We'll see if we can hook you up with Danny Faulkner.
Yeah, he's also really pretty biblical. So these guys are really looking at the scripture and trying to see the science that comes from the scriptural statements, which there's not a lot there, but there's some real key
Yes.
principles there.
And when I read these guys, I just laugh. Sometimes I laugh out loud.
Oh, it is.
Because it's just all a story. And they need more than that.
It's imaginary.
To be in a science book, don't you have to have real science?
Yeah.
I guess not anymore.
No.
Well, we're going to have to wrap it up now. Thank you for joining us today, and thank you, Mike Byrd, for being my guest today on the Creation Corner. God bless.